Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And it's good to see you all here today. So for about 6 months, we had been studying the Lotus Sutra. And I guess using that as a context, I would like to come back to discussion of a central text in Soto Zen Buddhism, written by Dogen Zenji, the Fukazazenji, which roughly translates universally recommended instruction for Zazen, universally recommended instruction for Zazen. So when this was actually written is not entirely agreed upon. Traditionally, it's been believed that Dogen wrote this when he returned from his journey to China in 1227. But there are various versions of the text that are extant because he continued to revise this text throughout his lifetime of 53 years. So I'd like to start by putting this into some context. Some context that we may be able to relate to. What was going on in Japan during the lifetime of Dogen? Well, there was a lot going on. And of course, much of what was going on involved ordinary people living their lives, feeding their families, taking care of their properties, finding shelter, doing the things that people do. But on a larger scale, there was much tumult. And that was in part because the governance of Japan was not settled. Traditionally, there had been an imperial court in Kyoto that was in charge of much of what we now call Japan. And it was the center of what we would call civilization in Japan. And there was an emperor who presided over the court. And actually, it appears that Dogen was an illegitimate son of one of the courtiers in the imperial court. But the imperial court was not the only governance of Japan at that time, because there had arisen a warrior class with warlords who were gaining power over much of the territory of Japan. And a system was developing where there was a sort of a head warlord, a shogun, who had what we might call vassals in various provinces. And the vassals had sort of sub-vassals, various princes who had property that was worked and maintained by serfs. So it was the arising of a medieval culture in Japan. At about the same time, there was a similar structure, hierarchical structure in Europe. So the shogunate had its capital somewhat to the east, near what present-day Tokyo, in an area called Kamakura. And the shogunate was gaining more and more power. It was essentially independent militias that had been set up to secure power over the country. And the emperor, the 84th emperor of Japan, became uncomfortable with this situation during Dogen's lifetime. In fact, around the time he was entering adulthood, and challenged the shogunate, which turned out badly for the emperor. And in 1221, when Dogen was 21 years of age, the emperor was exiled to Sado Island, and complete power over most of Japan was taken over by the shogunate. The imperial court was maintained, but it was relatively powerless. So also at that time, there were famines and pestilence, plagues, various things going on in Japan. It was a very unstable, difficult time for people. And Dogen was growing up in this environment as an orphan as of 7 years of age when his mother died. So he did not have a stable family life either. He was raised in the court, however, and was apparently acquired a very good education, quite knowledgeable in Japanese culture, and in Buddhist writings, the extent that they were available in Japan at that time. He was uncomfortable, though, in his situation, uncomfortable to the point that at 13 years of age, he left home and went to see his uncle, who was a monk, and his uncle arranged for him to be ordained as a monk at Hiei Monastery, the central monastery in Japan at that time, at age 13. The monasteries were really the center of learning. So in some ways, it was an ideal, I'm sorry about the interruption there. In some ways, it was an ideal situation for Dogen to be in. He had access to as much literature as was available and absorbed it like a sponge. But Ihe Monastery was the central monastery for the Tendai tradition of Buddhism, which had really been embraced by the imperial court. So it was essentially the established religion in the land at the time. And the Tendai tradition of Buddhism held the Lotus Sutra to be the central text. And it was a somewhat eclectic school in that it incorporated practices from other different schools in ultimately from China, including what we would call sitting meditation practice, silent meditation practice, but also what would be called Pure Land practices, the recitation of, or the chanting of Nembutsu, the Buddha's name, and other so-called esoteric practices, visualizations, and various other kinds of chanting and recitation. And Dogen was unhappy at the monastery at some point because he found it too undisciplined and worldly. He was looking for something with greater purity. So he left Hiei rather, monastery, and went to Kaninji, and there encountered a teacher, Myosun, who had studied Renzai Zen or Linji Zen, and found this much more satisfactory, develop a bond with Myosun. And they together, along with two other monks apparently, had a plan to go to China to study there, to get the real thing as they viewed it. So in 2023, Dogen, Myosun, and two other monks left to go to China. Now, going to China at that time for monks was a rather treacherous thing. Reportedly, the previous time that monks had left to go to China was about 5 years before, and a small group of monks left to go to China and were never heard of again. The sea voyage was difficult because of the presence of recurrent storms and the nature of the boats that they were using at that time. But they made it to China, and there, after visiting a number of monasteries, Dogen ended up at a monastery where he met what he called his true teacher, Ru Jing, who was of the Taodong school of Buddhism, which embraced sitting meditation to the extreme. So they would, get up at like 4 o'clock or earlier in the morning, and sit meditation essentially all day long until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and get a little bit of sleep, and then start the whole thing over again. And that was the main practice at that monastery, along with a certain amount of chanting, but not very much, and visitations with the abbot Ru Jing. Ru Jing kind of took Dogen under his wing and treated him like a son. So there was that combination of strict discipline and compassion, love, that Dogen no doubt craved at that time, being fatherless through his childhood. So a little bit of background about how Dogen got to the point of writing the Fukazazenji. He absorbed all this information he could, all this texts and literature that he could in China, and had the intention to bring it back to Japan, to his native land, and to spread the true Dharma. So I'll read the Fukazazenji is not terribly long, but we'll take it in parts. And the first part is more or less a motivation for the practice of Zazen, which Dogen at that time thought should be practiced by everyone because it was the way to awakening. So, Fukazazenji, the way is basically perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent upon practice and realization? The Dharma vehicle is free and untrammeled. What need is there for concentrated effort? Indeed, the whole body is far beyond the world's dust. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It is never apart from one, right where one is. What is the use of going off here and there to practice? And yet, if there is the slightest discrepancy, the way is as distant as heaven from earth. If the least like or dislike arises, the mind is lost in confusion. Suppose one gains pride of understanding and inflates one's own enlightenment, glimpsing the wisdom that runs through all things, attaining the way and clarifying the mind, raising an aspiration to escalade the very sky. One is making the initial partial excursions about the frontiers, but is still somewhat deficient in the vital energy of total emancipation. Need I mention the Buddha, who was possessed of inborn knowledge? The influence of his 6 years of upright sitting is noticeable still, or Bodhidharma's transmission of the mind seal. The fame of his 9 years of wall sitting is celebrated to this day. Since this was the case with the saints of old, how can we of today dispense with negotiation of the way? You should therefore cease from practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech, and learn the backward step that turns your light inward to illuminate yourself. Body and mind of themselves will drop away, and your original face will be manifest. If you want to attain suchness, you should practice suchness without delay. So Dogen in this passage really brings up a central question that motivated him by his own account as he traveled to China. And that was, if we are all endowed, as we might say, with Buddha nature, when we study the Lotus Sutra, everyone was on the path to becoming a Buddha. Everyone. Even people who had engaged in all kinds of illicit and evil activities were on the path to becoming Buddhas, everyone. We had this as our birthright, what might be called Buddha nature. So if that is the case, why do we have to work so hard? Why do we have to try so hard to awaken to Buddhahood? Why are we so stuck in delusion? Why is it necessary to meditate? So that was one of Dogen's central questions. And one thing that is characterized in this passage that I read is Dogen's propensity for borrowing. And he wasn't plagiarizing, he was just sort of reusing various ideas and text that had been passed down from his during the in the tradition of Buddhism in China. So when he mentions, and yet if there is the slightest discrepancy, the way is as different as heaven from earth, he is directly quoting from an earlier poem written by Senkan in the 6th century of China, called the Faith Mind poem, or Faith in Mind. The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. When love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undistinguished. Make the slightest distinction, however, and heaven and earth are set infinitely apart. If you wish to see the truth, then hold no opinions for or against anything. To set what you like against what you dislike is the disease of the mind. So in this passage, Dogen is advocating going beyond intellectual or conceptual mind to try to find an answer to his central question, the central question of his early life. Why do we need to practice? Why do we need to try so hard? Why is it so difficult? And there are various non-conceptual practices, and Dogen was not alone in trying to reform the Buddhism at the time. Dogen emphasized sitting meditation, zazen, but other reformers emphasized other aspects of Tendai practice and really kind of advocated a single practice approach to Buddhism, such as those who advocated along the lines of Pure Land Buddhism, Honen and Shinran, who advocated reciting the Nembutsu, the Buddha's name, repeatedly as a way of going beyond conceptual or intellectual mind to an awareness that is more complete. And then there were those who advocated the use of visualizations or the recitation of the title of the Lotus Sutra, such as Nichiren. But these are all practices that help carry us beyond our usual mode of thinking. So, in thinking about this, I thought, well, was there some sort of central question? Was there anything, I mean, can I relate to that in some way that when I was Dogen's age, at the time that he was going through all of this, was there some sort of central question I had? And one thing that occurred to me is that in the teen years, I I often wondered why there was something rather than nothing at all. Why is there anything? Why does anything exist? It just seemed, in a way, kind of impossible, uh, so unlikely as to be just unimaginable that things actually are here, that things exist. Maybe some of you have had, questions like that in mind that at various times during your life that um, motivated you, that motivated you to seek to find something beyond what you currently experienced in life. And what is the role of these non-intellectual practices, of these rituals? And in my opinion, Zazen is a kind of ritual, a kind of silent chanting, a going beyond discriminatory mind, conceptual mind, to an awareness that is more all-encompassing. So I guess I'll stop there, and we'll be talking more about other parts of the the remaining parts of the Fukazazenji, where it gets into more technique, more practical guidance as to how we do this, um, and ends up with a few paragraphs of encouragement at the end. So, what are these central questions that typically don't have answers within our intellect? And what is the role of these practices to carry us beyond? I'll stop there, and we'll break up into groups, and maybe if any parts of this aroused your intention or brought to mind personal experiences, you can discuss those. And then we'll get back together towards the end. Thank you very much for listening today.